you have your Bibles, if you turn to the Book of Ruth, we started a series last week studying this amazing, incredible book, Old Testament Book of Ruth, and it's so powerful, it's intimate, it's life-changing, it's inspiring. And last week when we looked at this, we looked at chapter 1, and in chapter 1 we see this gal named Naomi. And Naomi, she's living in a foreign land. She was originally from Bethlehem. Now she's in a place in Moab. And she's been living in this foreign land. And while she's there, she loses her husband. She loses her 2 sons. And she's in this incredible place of devastation. Everything has been taken away from her. And she's struggling to trust God in this experience. She's completely hopeless here. And so she decides, you know what, there's nothing left for me here in Moab. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. But she looks at her 2 daughter-in-laws and she says, listen, there's no reason for you to come with me. You're from this area. This is home to you. Just stay here. I'll be okay. You stay here. You find some other men, marry some other men, have some additional kids, or have some kids, whatever. I'm going to go back. And the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, she listens. She decides to stay, but her other daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, not a chance. We find in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, Ruth says this, she says, don't urge me to leave you or turn my back from you. She has this incredible, this fierce loyalty. She says, wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you stay, I'll stay. And then not only is she going to make a declaration of loyalty to a person in Naomi, she's going to make a declaration of dependence on God. She says these words. She says, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And all of a sudden here, things start to change. Naomi and Ruth, they go back to Bethlehem, and we start to see the beginning of hope. Chapter 1 begins with this sad, sad story, and now all of a sudden, there starts to be a glimmer. Hope is on the horizon here. But they don't see it yet, but we see it. Naomi flees Moab. She leaves there completely empty, but now she arrives in Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is called the house of bread. She's not alone. She has Ruth with her. And then chapter 1 ends with these words. It says, and they arrived just as the barley harvest was beginning. Despair turning to hope. Last week, Pastor Mike concluded his message this way. He said, God always has hope, even in the most devastating times. And I would say to you this morning that God always has hope. You might be here this morning, you might feel lost. You might feel like you're in despair. You might feel like everything is falling apart. You might feel completely empty-handed. Today, as we look at a study, we're going to look at the attributes of Ruth. We're going to look at the attributes of a guy by the name of Boaz. But in it all, we're going to see the power and the presence of God working in the midst of horrible, hopeless situations. So here we go. Naomi and Ruth, we're in chapter 2. Naomi and Ruth, they're back in Bethlehem. And Ruth says, this is verse 2 and 3. Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eye I find favor. So she went out, she entered a field, and she began to glean behind the harvesters. Now, for you and me, we may not get this. This isn't a concept that's typically known in our culture today. But back then, there was instruction that was given. Kind of a rule, kind of a law. It's listed in Leviticus chapter 19. It's the instruction of Moses. But Moses instructs landowners. So if you're here and you had a farm, you have a farm, this instruction would apply to you. He would say to the landowners of a farm, he would say, leave whatever the harvesters miss so that the poor, the foreigners, the widows, and the fatherless could glean for themselves something. It was God's way of providing for those who were down and out. And here you have Ruth, who is the epitome of down and out. She's poor, she's a foreigner, and she's a widow. And so verse 3 says this, it says, so she went out, she entered a field, she began to glean behind the harvesters, and then your Bible says this, as it turned out. I want you to underline that in your head for a moment. As it turned out. Other translations, other versions would say this, and it just so happens. I want you to catch this morning because this is one of the big themes of Ruth, and this is one of the biggest takeaways that you can get in this story today. You say, why? As it turned out. Why is that such a big deal? Why are you making such a fuss over this? Well, what's the point in this? Here's the deal you're going to find in these 4 chapters of Ruth. There is no place in these 4 chapters that you're going to see any recorded supernatural miracles from God. None. It's probably one of the only books of the Bible where you don't see a miracle. You don't see a burning bush. You don't see a voice from heaven. You don't see manna coming from heaven. There's no healings. There's no raising of the dead. There's none of that. What you get here is as it so happened. What's the point? The point is this, on every single page and every single verse, all throughout these 4 chapters, we're going to see the power, the presence, and the providence of a very, very good God, but it's not going to come in the way of a miracle. Not the kind of miracles that we would expect. It's going to come how? As it just so happened. And I love this. Why? Because in my life and probably your life, that's most likely the way that God works. And you may be one of those people, you wake up in the morning, you're driving, you say, God, give me a front parking spot at Walmart, and pop, boom, there it is. And you go, God, aren't you so good? But for most of us live our lives faithfully for God, and God works supernatural things through normal, everyday, as it so happened. It just happens. And for some of us, if we just believe in kind of coincidence, happenstance, we don't even attribute to God's fingerprints leading and directing our lives. But this is exactly what's going to take place here in the book of Ruth. That God is going to be working out God is going to be working in natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural plan. This is typically how God works. Here in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, it says, as it turns out, Ruth was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Some people would go, that's just a neat coincidence. No, this is the power and the providence, the fingerprints of God. And this is how God works in your life. Romans 8:28 says this, we know that God works in all things and everything, in good things and in bad things. We know that God is working. And you may have never seen a miracle in your life, but I guarantee 100% that every single page, every single verse of your life has God trying to work in the midst of your situation. The question is, are you allowing him to, and do you recognize that that's God? You just go, I'm just lucky. Such a lucky dude. Watch how this turns out. And this is where the story of Ruth, if I'm being honest with you, this is where the story of Ruth starts to feel like a Hallmark movie a little bit. And some of you go, woohoo, I love those. And if you're like me, I hate those. But this one's not so bad. This one's not so bad. How is it like a Hallmark movie? Here you have Ruth. She is in her lowest possible position. She's a widow. She's poor. She's a foreigner now in Bethlehem. She's gleaning. She's picking up the leftovers. And then all of a sudden, cue the music. All of a sudden, in enters the handsome hero, Boaz. And all of a sudden, the love story begins. And we're going to look at this gentleman, Boaz, in just a moment. But before we get to him, I want to focus on some attributes of Ruth. Because Ruth is an incredible example, an incredible model for all of us. She's an amazing role model for women in our church, but especially for our single ladies. Ready? All the single ladies, all the single ladies. All right. So you didn't want to play along. Do like this. I don't care. No, I especially want to speak to some of the single ladies in our church because we're going to see here the attributes, the 4 attributes we can learn from Ruth's life. And especially for those who are looking for godly men in their life. Number 1, the first thing we see we see that Ruth is incredibly faithful to God. She turned away from her people. She turned away from false gods to serve the God of Israel. She made a determination that no matter what, she was going to put God first. She could have married a man from Moab, but she refused to be unequally yoked. Now, some of you know that concept. Some of you may not. Let me speak to this just for a second. The Bible speaks to the importance for those of you who are seeking a potential spouse to look for someone who's going to be as faithful to following God as you are, if not more. This idea of, I just met this guy and he's cute and whatever, and you have this list of what you're looking for in a man or a woman. If God is not first and foremost on that list, then that person is not for you. I'm just telling you. There are so many people in this room. I get the prayer requests every single week that says, pray for my spouse, that my spouse would come to know the Lord. Why? Because they know something. They say their relationship with the Lord is one of the most intimate things that they have, and they would love to share that with their spouse, but their spouse doesn't get it, and they recognize that there's something missing in the relationship because they would love for their spouse to be going after God the same way they're going after God. And it's the number one request of their life. Man, if you're looking for the person that God has for you, find someone who is passionate about God. Why? Because marriage is hard. It's difficult. But without Christ, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. She was faithful. She was faithful to God. Number two, we see she's loyal to her family. While Orpah stayed behind in Moab, Ruth made a sacrificial decision to stay with Naomi and go to Bethlehem. Ladies, be the kind of person who honors and celebrates and values family. Family is a gift from God. Don't just discard and say it's not important. Be someone who wants to build family. Well, God uses over and over again the illustration of family for us. When we talk about a church body, we say, this is a family. Family is valuable to God. Ruth valued family. Number three, she's a hard worker. She's not waiting around for someone to meet her needs. She doesn't see a man as the answer for her life. She's not, crying like a victim. She's up early. She's working. She's using the gifts, talents, and abilities that God has given her. She says, God, you've placed me in this situation today. And I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to allow you to work in me as I work hard unto you. And number four, she honors God morally. How do we know this? Because during this time, almost every widow was forced into prostitution in order to pay the bills. And she refused to do what most were doing. She was out working hard, sweating in the heat of the day. Ruth refused to compromise her spiritual morals and values. Ladies, if a man requires you to compromise to be with him, then he is not the man for you. And I guess it goes both ways. Sometimes women get concerned. They're like, well, if I don't, compromise, if I don't give a little bit, if I don't, meet his needs, if I don't check off this box, then he's not going to stick around. If that is the only reason he's going to stick around, then let him roll. These four attributes modeled by Ruth will serve you well. You can go your own way. Ruth does it the right way, and God honors her. Now on to Boaz. Ruth chapter 2, verse 4, it says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, the Lord be with you. And then he sees Ruth, and Boaz asks the overseers of the harvest, he says, who does that young woman belong to? And the overseers reply, she is the Moabite. She came back from Moab with Naomi. She came to us and she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the fields and she has remained here from morning till now, except for just a little short rest in the shelter. And immediately we see Boaz is taken by her. Let me share with you 7 attributes we can glean from Boaz. The first one, and again, every man, especially every single man, this is something that you can take to heart and work hard to develop. The first thing we see is he is a leader. Gentlemen, our world and our church is suffering from a lack of men leaders. There's a time where men were willing to lead. There was a time when women would allow men to lead. Ruth 2 tells us that Boaz is a man of standing, meaning in him is strength. That Boaz has inner strength, which means he has character, he has integrity. I want to challenge every single man in this room to focus on what it means to have inner strength, to have some depth, to have some substance, to be a man of character and integrity, a man of standing. Paul says this, it's good for you to have physical strength. Yeah, pump some iron, do some sit-ups, try a crunch once in a while, but more so it's important for us to grow in depth spiritually, because that is what will last. Men, fill your head with more than just stats from the most recent ESPN game. Substance, depth. I remember one day we were sitting at the kitchen table in high school, and my mom said this. She said, if you knew your Bible as much as you know the box scores for the New York Yankees, she ain't wrong. Be a leader. Boaz was a leader. Number 2, he is kind to his people. He's kind to his workers. Boaz was kind. He didn't consider himself something better than everybody else. One of the things I love about my dad has worked in all different levels, from blue collar to white collar. He's had employees and he's been an employee. And one of the things I love about my dad, it doesn't matter who we come in contact with. He shows respect to those people. The people older than him, the people who are under them. He treated them all the same all the time. Boaz was kind. Men, when it comes to being kind, kindness doesn't equate with weakness. You don't always have to be the macho guy. When it comes to women, men, speak kindly to women. Serve them. Be a little old-fashioned. Open the door. Allow them to go first. Pay the bill. Honor them. And when in doubt, just be nice to the girl. Just be nice to the girl. Things start to get a little hairy at home, and you get a little moody, and the fight starts. Just be nice to the girl. Just be nice to the girl. Number 3, we see here he's about the Lord. Boaz is about the Lord. I love this. Boaz shows up on the scene, and the first thing that comes out of his mouth is what? The Lord be with you, the Lord bless you. He's not afraid to talk about God. This isn't some pastor. He's not on some ministry opportunity. Yeah, for a lot of men, they say, well, my walk with Jesus is private. Well, yes, it is, but you also have an opportunity to be public about that. There's parts of my relationship with my wife that are private, but there's a lot of other parts that are certainly public. I don't just hide her in a corner and say, hey, I have this relationship. Hey, well, tell me about your wife. I just don't talk about that. That's just between me and her. No, Boaz shows up and he's willing to talk about God. Very public, on the job. And the first thing out of his mouth is, the Lord be with you, the Lord bless you. I love this. He's not selfish. He wants others to be blessed. Everything is not a competition. He doesn't have to win at everything. His ego is in check. He wants blessing for others, blessing for his employees. He's a good boss. He says, we're not just here to make a living for me. He says, I want to be a blessing for my employees. And then he blesses his poor widow. Number 4, he honors Ruth. Boaz says to Ruth, my daughter. He doesn't see himself as better than her. He doesn't talk down to her. He respects her at all cost. 5th, he commits to protect her. Number 5 and number 6, we're going to see men, for most women, the number one need in their life is safety and security. Safety and security. Boaz gets that. He commits to protect her. He tells Ruth this. He says, don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. He protected her. Men, be a protector of women. Protect their hearts. Protect their purity. Protect God's design and purpose for them. I already made insight to this one. Number 6, he promises to provide for her. He says this, he says, whenever you're thirsty, go get a drink from the water jugs the men have filled. Next week, we're going to see how incredibly generous and gracious this man is. But men, be the kind of man who's willing to do the best to provide for the safety and security of your wife, of your family. Now catch this. This is big. It's not just talking about making money. There are some of you who make plenty of money and you justify it because you go, I'm providing for my family. But if push come to shove, if you ask your wife and your kids, they would rather do without the money. They would rather have you provide time, provide engagement with the family, provide encouragement. That's the safety and security they're looking for. And you go, man, I'm just working hard because I want to provide. Sometimes your ego, sometimes your desire to win, sometimes that competitive spirit is covered in this, well, I'm just providing for my family. But push come to shove, many of your family say, I can do without the money. I'd just rather him be here. And finally, number 7, he prays for her. Boaz says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Men, ladies want someone who will pray for them and pray with them. Why? Because they need the power of presence of God in their life, and they feel the safest, the most secure when you're pointing them and your family towards Jesus. These are 7 attributes that men we need to work at. We need to be the kind of man who honors, protects, and blesses. So back to the story. So now it's the end of the day, and Boaz invites Ruth to come on over. He says, come over here, have some bread, dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted, and she had some left over. I love this. Ruth chapter 1 starts despair, devastation, hopelessness. We get to the middle now of Ruth chapter 2, and all of a sudden, God has provided. Not only is Ruth's belly full, but the Bible says that she has leftovers. This is the kind of God that we serve. The kind of God who does exceedingly abundantly more than we could ask, think, or imagine, because according to his power, that is his work within his people, that works even in those moments where we saw, and it just kind of happened. So just like any great chick flick, this is the part of the movie now where Ruth goes back to Naomi to tell her about the boy she met. You wouldn't believe this guy I met. What did he look like? Was he tall? Was he dark? Was he handsome? Did he have a beard? Of course he had a beard. They just da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's usually when I go to the bathroom. She tells him all about Boaz. Then Naomi tells her something incredibly exciting. Verse 20, she says, hey, I know this guy. Boaz is one of our closest relatives. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Other versions, translations would state that he is our kinsman redeemer. You say, what is that? Again, this was part of the custom during that time. During this time, it was understood that the closest living relative was responsible for redeeming the family when things got rough. So if a family member passed away, it was this individual's job to step in and say, I'm going to take care of that widow. I'm going to take care of those kids. If family property was going to be lost because of some kind of financial difficulty, this closest relative would step in and say, I'm going to buy that family to make sure that family, I'm going to buy that land to make sure that that land stays within our family for generations to come. If someone got in financial hardship and they were going to have to go into slavery to pay back their debt, this kinsman redeemer would show up on the scene and would say, you know what, I'll take care of that. That's our family. Naomi says, Boaz is our closest relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers. But here's the thing. Boaz isn't anything to Ruth. Anything. He's not obligated in any way to help her. He's connected to Naomi, but he owes nothing. She's not an Israelite. She's not technically a member of this family per se. She's just some daughter-in-law. And we'll find out later that Boaz really isn't even the closest relative. He doesn't owe Ruth anything, but we'll see next week in chapter 3, he chooses to give her everything, not because the law required it, because of grace. Grace required it. And this is what makes the story so wonderful for us. You may say, well, this is a nice story. This is all well and good. What does this have to do with me? You just gave me a history lesson. And if I'm ever on Jeopardy, I could go, okay, Ruth for 200. But what is the application for me here? Here's the deal. The entire book of Ruth is a metaphor. We are Ruth in this story. You say, how so? Ruth was empty, hopeless, in despair. She was a foreigner, just as we are foreigners to God, far from God, broken and empty. We've sinned against God. We've fallen short of his standards. Ruth came empty-handed with nothing to offer, and we too have nothing to bring to God. But yet we are blessed more than we could ever expect. See, everything good that we have is gleaned from the goodness of God, a God of love, a God of mercy, a God of grace. And God has blessed us more than we deserve. His grace has covered our sin. His power has made us new. His peace goes beyond anything our human ability can even understand. And just as Boaz invited Ruth to his table, Jesus too invites us to his table. He says, have the bread, have the wine, my body, my blood. He makes it available to us, not because we deserve it, but because of grace, because of God's great love for us. See, here's the deal. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter what today is like. God can make you new. He can invite you into his family. If you're hurting, if you're stuck, if you're caught in addiction, if you have no hope, if you're battling depression or anxiety or feel or mental health issues, whatever you're going through today, God sees you. And he invites you to himself. That's his heart. And if you would cry out to him, he would hear your prayers, and he will answer. And listen, just like a moment ago, I went teacher, chiropractor, guidance counselor, student. Man, if I stood people up in this room, and if I pointed out your past, where you've come from, we would be, our jaws would be on the ground. Because we all come with history. We all come with baggage. We all come with skeletons in our closet. We all come with things that we're so incredibly ashamed and embarrassed of. But God, we walked into life like Ruth with nothing. And God poured out his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness on us. And it changed everything. There's a transformation that happened in our heart. When you talk to some of these people about their past, they go, I don't even remember that person anymore because of what God has done. This is why when we come into a service and we say, lift up your voices and give praise to God, get your hands like this to like this, we go, that's easy. Because of the transformation that God has done in me. His grace. If you're here today, you've never experienced that grace, today's the day. If you're here today and you've forgotten where you've come from, today's the day. If you're here today and you've got lazy in your appreciation, that God has filled that empty spot, and now, man, there's stuff left over. You go, he has blessed me to overflowing. He has filled me to overflowing. Today's the day to address that, to fix that.